Welcome to another episode of Project Liberal Podcast. I am joined by my wonderful co-host, Tyler Harris.
Thank you, Max. It's great to be here. And Max and I are joined today by somebody who our listeners and viewers may be familiar with, the great, the wonderful, let's see here, where do I start? Anti-war activist, causer of the Georgia runoff a couple of elections ago, Libertarian candidate for President of the United States just last year. Chase Oliver. Chase, thank you for being here.
Hey, happy to be here, and thank you guys for having me, and look forward to a great discussion today. And I've done a lot, but over the last few months, had a little bit of time to take pause and reflect about all those things, so I'm happy to discuss that with you.
Yeah, well, let's start with some of that reflection. You know, you had the blessing or curse, as the case may be, to run in a very chaotic cycle with a motley crew of candidates, I dare say, the motliest of which ended up in the White House. And what are your takeaways from what has to have been one of the most wild experiences anyone can imagine?
Yeah, well, we often hear the phrase, "This is the most important election of your lifetime." I'm not going to say this was the most important election. It maybe will be. It may be, maybe there will be more important elections down the line. But I can certainly say this is the most unique election cycle I think I've seen in my lifetime, probably since, World War II, the modern political era. It's weird to think that almost 100 years ago was the modern political era. But we had a crazy Republican candidate. We had a situation where you had a sitting U.S. president running for half the cycle and then dropping out for his VP. We had an insurgent independent candidate with a lot of name value who took a lot of that third-party oxygen, which as a third-party candidate was kind of hard to breathe in. And then we had myself, Jill Stein, other folks like Randall Terry and Cornel West. I really got to meet all of them except for Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, and Joe Biden. You're right. It was a quite motley crew. Even through the nomination cycle, it was quite a blend of personalities. But I look on it as a good thing, even though it aged me, I feel like 10 years in a 2-year process. But that's to be expected when you're running across the country eating junk food and living out of a hotel room. So all in all, it was a blessing and the honor of my lifetime so far, because I'm not married and don't have kids yet.
I can't imagine the amount of stress that you must have gone through, Chase, in doing all that. But just out of curiosity, could you ever imagine doing something like that again? Or is this...
Well, I'll be honest with you. I told people even if I do this 20 years from now, I'll still be younger than Kamala Harris was this cycle. So I got plenty of time to think about doing this again. But I'll be completely frank and honest. I will not run as the Libertarian nominee for president again if the Libertarian Party is not in better shape than it was this cycle. Because one of the things that did cause an extra level of stress, I think that most Libertarian candidates have not really had to face, was a major, a downsizing of the party's resources, reach, as well as, some in leadership who were very combative to the idea of even running a Libertarian candidate, much less me. And certainly of the ones that were presented, I was the one that stuck in their craw the most. And so it provided its own unique circumstances. Again, very unique election cycle when you're having to battle some of your state and national party leadership to even be on the ballot in all 50 states. And then we had this Kennedy Victory Fund joint fundraising venture, which was, essentially our party's resources being used to fundraise for someone who wasn't the Libertarian candidate, and I was running against, and that was its own level of stress. And so, no, I would not run if it was the same as it was at this past nominating convention, but my aim and my goal in being now, I guess, a 39-year-old elder statesman to the Libertarian Party is to make sure that whomever our nominee is in 4 years, 8 years, 12 years, and however many years I'm involved in politics isn't facing these kinds of challenges.
Chase, I want to pull back here because I really want to understand. This is a great place to start. What happened, or how it happened to the Libertarian Party as an outsider? So, just as a bit of background, I thought of myself for a time as a libertarian. I was in the Bay Area, and I was doing entrepreneurial stuff. I was part of the seasteading community. I did all this cool. I thought of my. I cared about Hayek. I cared about liberty. I cared about a lot of these things. I still care about a lot. I still care about all those things. I finally, some years ago, I showed up to a Libertarian Party meetup group, and I sat down, and the first thing I started hearing about was this was maybe 2019, 2020, was a huge anti-vax. Like everybody at the tables was talking about how terrible vaccinations are, how we might have to deal with new vaccinations from what's gonna, from the COVID stuff. And immigration. Oh, they were telling me how immigration is definitely not a libertarian. Basically they were anti-immigration, anti-vax, conspiracy theorist type people. And I suddenly thought, wait a minute. This is not my crowd. I'm in the wrong room. I felt very out of place. And I realized the label libertarian does not describe, if that's what it is, it doesn't describe me. I'm not that. So what happened? Is this something that happened over time to the ideology as a whole? Is this something that specifically happened in the Libertarian Party and then kind of got loose into the rest of the political ecosystem?
Yeah, it was a little bit of.
Give us a history.
So I'll just say, some of this dates back all the way back to the 2016 time period of the party. Some of this, as you mentioned, really accelerated in 2020 during the pandemic. And so just to kind of pull back there, first and foremost, I don't think you're the only person with libertarian inclinations who's walked into a meeting and suddenly felt like, hey, is this really where I'm supposed to be? And I do think that's a matter of priority and a matter of focus. And traditionally, Libertarian Party has been one that focuses on things like economic freedom, individual liberty, free expression, free speech, freedom from government, like the freedom to live your life, even if it's completely different than the way I'm going to live my life. If you can do it in peace, and let's not require the government to have to regulate that in any way. Like, that's really the history of the Libertarian Party, dating back to 71 when we were breaking off because Nixon took us off the gold standard, refused to end the war in Vietnam. There was an emergence of gay rights that were happening in the early 70s that many libertarians felt akin to, right? And it was really around the election of Donald Trump in 2016, the Charlottesville demonstrations, and we had a party chair who vociferously, and I would say I would support the same message that he put out there, that, hey, that crowd in Charlottesville who's protesting and who one of their people ran over someone and killed somebody, that's not our crew. They don't represent us. And there were some in that, in those organizations that felt like, well, no, I identify as a libertarian. How dare the national chair push me aside? And some of those folks organized, and they created kind of a boogeyman in the party apparatus and said, these are not strong people. They're just the Washington, D.C. libertarians who like to go to cocktail parties at the Cato Institute. They're not really fighting for you. And that became kind of a calling message for a certain segment of what I would say on the right, people who maybe didn't have an ideology or who felt lost in the traditional Republican Party because it was a pro-war party, big government party at that point under Bush, right? They were lost, and maybe they glommed onto this idea that libertarianism means it's for me, I get mine. And I don't think that's really the message of the Libertarian Party. And, I think a lot of this accelerated in COVID. I'm a healthy skeptic of medicine. I don't really like the medical establishment a lot of the times. I find most things that interact with government to be quite corrupted, and medicine itself is quite entwined in government. But also, I'm not somebody who is just going to think that, everything is bad, right? Everything that the government has ever touched or ever looked at is bad. And vaccinations are no different. I'm somebody who got vaccinated as a kid. If I had kids, they are going to get vaccines because I don't want them to get easy to avoid illnesses, right? But I also believe you should make your own choices for things. And that's not enough for some of these folks. They demand that you have to actively oppose people who, for instance, decided to get a COVID vaccination. That how dare they do that? You must be playing into the government narrative. You're being a government dupe if you decide for yourself to do something. And I just don't think that that's the way we need to grow the libertarian message, the message of liberty or free choice, free exercise of your own choices. And so for me, That's just not how I roll. And I'm trying to change the nature of the party back to that more classical libertarian, which much has classical liberal values that, the Hayeks and the Miseses of the world really would have liked to have seen in their day, and that the people like John Hospers and Harry Brown and a lot of other great people who really founded this party, even early Rothbard. Early Rothbard would be not liking late Rothbard. And let's get back to the classical libertarianism. That's my goal.
So I want to jump in, Chase, a little bit, because I feel like, when you're close to it, and I understand what it's like to be close to something like this, when you're close to it, sometimes there's a shorthand that can lose people on the outside looking in. It seemed like in that explanation you gave, you go very, very quickly from, the party condemns the tiki torch Nazis at Charlottesville, and and some people see that and say, this party doesn't represent me. Well, who the heck sees that and says this doesn't represent me?
Yeah.
Right? How do we get from point A to point B? And and if there is this large number of libertarians that take a condemnation of neo-Nazism in the streets of Charlottesville as this personal affront or this abandonment of libertarian positions or abandonment of libertarian philosophy, how did that pool of people come to view libertarianism as an identity that applied to them?
Well, two ways that happened. First, we have to remember that even among the Libertarian Party, right, that doesn't represent all libertarians. And I would wager most libertarians don't identify at all with those kind of incendiary politics, to which I fully reject as a libertarian. And so we do have to remember that even talking outside the party, the greater liberty movement overall, I think, should be rejecting these things. And I think by and large they do. When you look at things like Students for Liberty events, Cato Institute, other large libertarian institutions, they actively reject this. But what happened was
if they do reject it, how do they then feel unrepresented at demonstrations of rejecting?
Yeah, and then there's this small, very hardcore section of this kind of very lost people on the right who found libertarianism to be something they could kind of glom onto. They're anarchistic in their economic policies, but really maybe hop onto these reactionary kind of thinkers. And I think what happened is the Libertarian Party itself is in a position, the way we nominate our leadership, the way we nominate our candidates, it's very easy for a small number of very dedicated people to be more invested than the average libertarian who's living their life, raising their family, running a business. They can't be at every single meeting. They can't be super hyper invested in every online post and in everything that happens. But those who have the time and the inclination to do it very easily can storm into a room and take over a small political party. We've seen this in other political parties. It's happened in the past. And it's one of the things that I encourage libertarians to actively reject, that we cannot succumb to the whims of populism, which is where I think a lot of this comes from. And I think a lot of this is ultimately reflective of MAGA, the way MAGA has changed our politics. And it didn't just change the Republican Party, it changed the entire political structure when we saw this insurgent movement in one of the major political parties. Because when you see that great change, a lot of the people who are in the minor political parties are like, that's what we need to glom onto. That's what we need to reflect. We need to be just like them. And we'll suddenly grow and we'll suddenly get lots of notice. But the truth is you end up being a junior league version of MAGA at best. And you don't get the attention you really think you're going to get. You're no longer contrasting yourself. And even the Democratic Party's got its own problems because since MAGA's shown up, their reaction to MAGA has been pretty piss poor in my opinion, as the other major political wing out there. And so I think ultimately a lot of this comes down to the way politics changed, the way politics got more angry and disgusting and ugly. And I'm hoping that fever can break. And I really see if the tariffs keep going up, that fever is going to break hopefully sooner than later.
Chase, I want to push on this little issue here, which is the term. So there's two things to separate out, right? One is libertarianism as a kind of a political identity, and one is the Libertarian Party and what it's up to. I don't even like. I no longer. I used to think of myself as libertarian, as I mentioned. I no longer do, and I do not walk into a room and ever tell people anymore that I'm a libertarian. Why? Because I feel like using that label is going to do more to confuse people in that room as to what I believe or who I am or what I identify with than illuminate any of that stuff. So I'll use different labels for myself in different rooms depending on what I think people understand. Libertarian is no longer one of them. So and it's because of the things you're describing, how the term even has become kind of polluted, I would say, by people who are misusing it and using it to mean something very different than what those of us on this call might mean. So is there any hope of turning that around and getting that term to mean something more like what we might agree or hope that it would mean, again, to the average person out there?
Yeah, first, to the average person, when I walk into a room and describe myself as a libertarian, the question I most still often get is, what is that? Right? Very few people, even outside of the more politically like-minded folks, really have any idea what the Libertarian Party is or even what the Libertarian label means, which is actually a good thing because it allows the individual like myself to be able to best reflect the Libertarian Party. And I think we need to be promoting folks who do believe in that classic version of libertarianism, which is live and let live, get the government out of our lives, keep taxes low or eliminate them altogether, and remove burdensome regulations that make it hard to either start a business or live our lives, right, in peace. That is a general message that I think a lot of people could be very attracted to. And so I don't think it's hopeless, because I think most people just generally don't know. But I do think we as libertarians do need to really reflect on this moment and see what this MAGA populism is doing and really fully reject it. Because there's been a lot of, frankly, there's not even been a lot of tiptoeing around it. They invited, our party leadership invited Donald Trump to our last national convention, where he was rightfully booed. He was. It felt good to boo him, but it didn't feel good to have him on our stage. It didn't feel good to give him a platform. It didn't feel good to have him speaking with the word libertarian behind him, because that is what's going to really confuse our brand. And so I think it's now important for the current leadership of our party and whomever we elect at our next convention, and I will not be supporting anybody who thinks that it was a good idea to bring Donald Trump to our convention. And I will be using every bit of resource I have as the last presidential candidate to say we should reject anybody who, for instance, supported any kind of fundraising apparatus for Robert Kennedy, who, again, not libertarian, not our candidate for president, and has put our party in a very precarious situation with the FEC, which I think is its own ball of wax that if you're not really super invested in the Libertarian Party, don't worry about it. If you are, you're probably sweating today.
I mean, Chase, my understanding is that the Libertarian Party, since this whole debacle, it lost support. It obviously lost ballot access in some states. It's just not been good. As sort of a closing of this topic for our discussion today, what do you see as the future of your Libertarian Party, frankly, of the one that you call home still? Where do you see it going, and what do you see as the biggest challenges to overcome in order to get back even to where it was before all of this happened?
Yeah, I think it's going to take some people who have maybe felt burnt out by this whole infighting. I understand it, right? You can't stay involved in it forever without it aging you. I know this is a candidate who had to fight my own fights internally. But it's going to take some people who have been burnt out in the past to return. I'll give you a great example. I ran to be the chair of the Libertarian Party of Georgia recently, and it was a very close race. And while I'm a member of my executive board and we have a very good board of people, I think it would have been better had I been chair. If 3 more people had been in the room to support me for chair, I would be the chair of the Libertarian Party of Georgia today. And we might be seeing a very different direction. It's important to have people in the room. And you don't need a whole lot of them, to be frank. You need you and a few of your friends to come and make a difference. When 3 or 4 votes in a room, in a conference room, in a hotel makes a difference for who your state party leadership is, I would encourage people who maybe don't feel super enthused to be a libertarian these days to be kind of enthused, pay the party dues, go there and make the party what you want it to be, because it can be something better. Trust me, I spoke to people all over the country who desperately want a third party who represents them and represents the message of leave me alone if I'm not hurting anybody. That can be pro-parental choice, pro-LGBTQ, pro-immigration, anti-war, anti-tax, and anti-big government. That is a message that rings true with so many people. And so we have the potential to go in that path if we work towards that path. Or we can let the party fall by the wayside and continue to fall into irrelevance. I'm going to fight for that.
I want to push a little on that, though, Chase, because, I I think about that room that you just mentioned in Georgia. It's not a room that I was in, but you lost by 3 votes, presumably to a candidate from the part of the party that's taken it in a direction that I think we would disagree with, a direction that's supportive of Trump, a direction that's supportive of of funneling money to Kennedy's campaign, that's supportive of a direction that would be more sympathetic to the people carrying tiki torches in Charlottesville than the people getting hit by their cars.
I would say definitely the Kennedy part, for sure.
That is not a room that I want to invite 3 people into. That's not a room that I want to tell any of my friends to go stand in. If you have somebody who's waking up right now, as so many people are because of what's going on in this country, waking up to politics for the first time, and as they're starting to pay attention for the first time, they realize that they care about the LGBTQ community. They see trans people being persecuted by those on the right, and their heart goes out. They see the disaster of tariffs. They understand the wisdom of free markets. They understand the abuses that the administration is engaging in with the absence of due process. So they understand due process. They understand the inherence of those rights. They understand the value of an open and compassionate and liberal immigration policy. And they're coming to those policies, those beliefs, those positions for the first time in light of what's happening in the world today. Are you going to send them into the Libertarian Party such as it is now?
Yes, and here's why.
Do you have reticence there?
I mean, I have reticence to send anybody into any room of politics, honestly. It's a stressful thing. But I'll tell you why I still believe the Libertarian Party is the best room to send them into. Certainly don't send them to the Republican Party. They're the people who are actively being responsible for much of what you mentioned right now. But you also don't want to be putting them into a room of Democrats who actively empowered through the signing of the NDAA, the support of the war on terror initiatives that give the president so much power, the fact that Obama was the deporter-in-chief, the fact that much of the war that we're seeing around the world has been supported by the leaders of the Democratic Party. You know, there's not a lot of great places to go in terms of politics these days. But the one that I think is the easiest to fight for and to send a clearer message and to change is the Libertarian Party. It's much harder to change the Republican or Democratic Party these days. They are already pretty rotten to the core. I believe there is much more to salvage from the Libertarian Party, and I would urge anybody who's paying attention to what's going on to fully reject the two-party system and to find the party that's best for them. I think it's the Libertarian Party for me. For some people, that might be the Green Party or a different third party. There's a Liberal Party out there, right? Maybe that's where they want to land. But I believe there's enough infrastructure, legacy, and philosophy and principle left in the Libertarian Party to be salvaged. I fully think it can grow and be better than it is today. And we've had dips and valleys in the past. We've had major infighting. We've had major influxes. We've had major changes of messaging. And ultimately, the party outlived that. And I think it can again. I really do. I think we will outlive MAGA, just like I think the Democrats and the Republicans will eventually do so as well. I just don't feel reticent to go back to the two-party system. I just don't feel ready to do that.
I want to push back here, Chase, and I want to just take a little bit of what Tyler was saying about this. You said you wouldn't send these people, the kind of people we're talking about, into a room full of Republicans. There, I would agree with you. You wouldn't send them into a room full of Democrats. There, I don't know that I would agree with you, because I think we both are watching that the Democratic Party is floundering right now, right? Some of them, like the Bernie and the sort of Elizabeth Warren wing and all this stuff, they're kind of like, wow, the tariffs. Okay, well, I mean, I don't like that he did it, but they're pretty good. I like tariffs. Let's do more tariffs. That's totally the wrong approach. But I do think there's a wing of the Democratic Party that's maybe an upstart wing. It's this abundance faction of the Democratic Party, and they're more for growth and free markets and technology and a lot of the things that I think we would care about. Clearly, we would have some disagreements with them too, but they're definitely a much better version of what we would want the Democrats to be than what we're seeing on the Bernie and Warren wing. So maybe we should send people into the rooms full of Democrats to help support that abundance faction, because if we can swing the Democratic Party in that direction, don't you think that would be incredibly valuable to do?
I mean, I honestly think that's the same argument of, hey, we should vote Republican because Thomas Massie and Justin Amash and Rand Paul are pretty good on some things. and they might be supporting some things too. For some people that works. It doesn't work for me. I actively reject the two-party system, and I have to find a home, and I find the Libertarian to be the closest aligned with me in terms of our policy and in terms of our platform. That does not work for everybody. And I want the Libertarian Party to work for more people. Certainly, that's what I'm going to be doing. I don't want people who are LGBTQ to walk into a room of libertarians and feel uneasy. Has that happened to me in the past? Certainly. Did I get my fair share of homophobia both within and outside the Libertarian Party running as a gay candidate for president? You bet that happened to me. And I want to make sure that doesn't happen again in the future. But it only happens if I'm cleaning up the mess and being a leader and not being somebody who's going to shy away from the fight. I'm happy to get in the arena and shout down assholes. It's what I did my entire youth as a punk rocker. Just imagine me with a mohawk and a leather jacket on right now, kicking the Nazi punks out of the concert. That's what I had to do back in the day at the concert hall. And if I have to do that in the politics hall, I'll do it too. If that's what it takes. Because I do believe there needs to be a home for people who don't want to vote within the two-party system and who aren't big government folks like Green Party people, right? I want there to be a place for that empathic person who believes in small government. And it certainly isn't the Republican Party right now, and I just don't think the Democratic Party is going to transform into some sort of beacon of libertarianism or beacon of liberty. It'll improve, certainly. I hope the Republican Party improves too. But in the meantime, I'm going to keep organizing outside of it. And if they want my vote, they better earn it. And if they want to earn my vote, they at best better let me get on the ballot and run people.
I want to transition us to kind of a different question different topic that I've had on my mind, which is I don't think most people out there have any interest in learning about, for example, trade policy or geopolitics or political history or political philosophy or a lot of the things that maybe all of us on this call are really interested in. But frankly, the average person out there just isn't interested in this stuff. This isn't what's going to be taking up their day. They don't even pursue it as kind of a hobby. That's not how their brain functions. And for a long time, I think I personally fought against that. Like I was very much about how do we get people to care about this stuff, to learn about this stuff, the kinds of things that you would understand if you sat in an introductory economics course and learned about comparative advantage and opportunity cost and all the rest. And honestly, as of late, I have finally given up on trying to do that for the average adult out there. I still think it's valuable to do that with kids and young people, and sure, they're more open to learning about stuff, to thinking about that. But instead, I now, and I've done this with my own family members who were traditional Republicans before, and now many of them are Trump supporters. I've had this approach. I've said, look, I'm not going to argue with you about trade and deficits and all this stuff and whatever. Let's just talk about character. Character is something that the average person understands. Let's go 80-20, right? 80% of people kind of know what it means to be next to somebody or deal with somebody who would honor contracts, who is virtuous, who embodies, wisdom and prudence and temperance and benevolence and whatever other virtues we care to talk about. Most people have some understanding of what that means. No two people will exactly agree, but most people have an understanding what that means. And so if you can convince people, just do not endorse, support, vote for individuals who are of low moral fiber, who are not virtuous, who do not have good character, however you want to interpret that, but who don't have those traits, don't vote for those people. And because even my own family, members of them, would say, "Oh yeah, Trump. Well, yeah, he's not the best guy out there. He's not, but the other Kamala, she was even worse. Or he's an asshole, but he's our asshole. He'll do the right thing eventually, even though you wouldn't trust him with your kids or something. But he'll do what needs to be done." And my new approach is to say, no, focus on character. And if it doesn't matter. If you think both of the primary candidates running are of poor character, maybe you think Kamala was a terrible person in that way, don't vote for either of them. Vote for a third party. Chase, you seem like a great guy. As far as I understand, and I did a little bit of background research, you would pass the bar for me. Go vote. So in such a case, go vote for a third party, or write someone's name in, or don't show up to the polls. Do not endorse and support candidates who are of low moral fiber. Just don't, under any circumstances. Because if you think that they're going to end up helping you in the long run, even if you think their policies are in line with yours or would do something, that is just what they might be saying in order to get into office. Because a person of no scruples is going to act that way. They'll say whatever needs to be said, and then they'll get into office, and then they'll talk about taking over Canada or Greenland or whatever, and you're like, wait, where did this come from? We all knew what Trump was when he said grab him by the, we all knew at that point. There was no doubt. There couldn't be any doubt in anybody's mind. And at that point, everybody should have said, it doesn't matter how much it sounds like I might agree with him on DEI or whatever, he's not my candidate. I cannot vote for this guy.
Yeah.
So what is your reaction to this? Do you think this is a good approach?
Well, I think it is. I think it's worth talking about because, I'll say this. He's an asshole, but he's our asshole is great when you're talking enforcers on your hockey team. It's not dangerous when you're talking about a reality game show host, which is what Donald Trump was, right? It does matter when he's starting to take a position of leadership, when he's representing us as a nation. And I don't think he does a good job of that. Like, I could point to many of the moral failings. I mean, I'll give you right now, I'm a church-going guy. I'm someone who goes to church, and I have a close relationship with my faith. I find it very insulting that not only does the man sell a Bible, like the Trump Bible, which is ridiculous, printed in China, by the way. I wonder if he's tariffing his own Bibles.
I didn't know about this one. That is mind-boggling.
But also, that when asked, in an interview, like, oh, you're a man of great faith, like, are you more of an Old or New Testament guy? Oh, I like them both. Well, can you name one verse? Nah, I like it all. If you can't name one section of the Bible, one story, one parable, one psalm, one prayer that has meant something to you, you're being disingenuous, and it really hurts me as a person of faith for that. But even when you look at, like, me as an individual, I'm working class. I've never been a rich man. I worked as a contractor for a few years, and guess who he stiffed all the time when he made his buildings? Contractors, people who put up the crown molding, people who ran the electrical wires, people who put up the drywall of his crappy hotels. They're the ones who got stiffed on the work. And then look at who else got screwed with the power of things like eminent domain when he was a businessman. He stole a woman's house to build a parking garage. An old woman. Would you want your grandmother to be kicked out of the house she's had for most of her life so that some billionaire asshole could build a parking garage for his casino? Is that the kind of person you want leading this country? And that's before he ever touched the world of politics. And so for me, yeah, it is very upsetting that people will excuse great moral failings in people to say, well, he's going to lower my taxes. There's a lot of really good people out there that if elected would lower your taxes too. People of great moral standing, right? I can name a half dozen great people who have either wanted to serve in elected office or have served in elected office who would be a hell of a lot better morally than Donald Trump, even if you don't agree with all their politics. And that goes for both sides of the aisle. He is a pretty corrupted individual, and that's what I think is corrupting our politics, not just in the Republican Party, but across the spectrum. I think really since Donald Trump and MAGA has ascended, this kind of nationalist populism has poisoned everybody. And you're right, even some of the Democrats are like, hey, tariffs are good on the right people. And so I don't think it's I really do think it's a good strategy to probably fight that fight saying, would you let this person like watch your bank account? Would you trust this person to sell you a product if no one was looking over their shoulder? Because I don't. I certainly don't in Donald Trump. Kamala Harris, I have my scruples with her too. I'm pretty sure she's probably just as untrustworthy as any other politician that makes it to the role of vice president, J.D. Vance included. But Donald Trump had like decades of that, like well before he was a politician. So it still baffles me how he ever graduated from host of The Celebrity Apprentice, which I'll be honest, I was a fan of that show. I loved watching that show. When he's telling Meatloaf and LaToya Jackson that they're doing a bad job and that one of them's going to get fired. Like, that's quality entertainment television, and that's where a buffoon like that belongs. He does not belong in the Oval Office. He does not belong today, as we're recording this, to be in the Oval Office with Bukele kissing his ass while Bukele and him laugh about bringing an innocent man back from a torture prison. This should alarm everybody. This should alarm, and this is one of the things I'm trying to snap libertarians out of. Libertarians were outraged at the CIA black sites of 9/11. They were outraged at the NDAA signed by Barack Obama. But innocent people being snatched off the streets and sent to an El Salvadorian prison? I'm hearing too much silence, not just from libertarians, but everybody that claims to represent the Constitution and want to protect it. And it's really outrageous.
I feel like, and unfortunately, Max, I hate to break it to you, but independently perhaps of your efforts, I do feel like I've had some of the transformation that you're talking about wanting to affect with more voters, in that over the last year or so, I've just as a voter have realized more and more how much more values matter to me than policy positions. And that's not to say that I don't have a whole raft of preferred policy positions, because of course I do, right? But just that somebody who disagrees with me about those policy prescriptions, but shares my core values, shares an intellectual curiosity, shares an openness to people and ideas and experiences, has a recognition of the fundamental humanity that exists within other people, that manifests some basic level of empathy as a result of that. Somebody who shares those traits and doesn't see eye to eye with me on even on economic policy, which I know matters a lot. Like, we're all three of us really big free market guys, right? And that's important, that we feel like that comes from our values. But even somebody who disagrees with me about tariffs, or disagrees with me about trade, or disagrees with me about, what the ideal tax system should be, maybe even disagrees with me directionally about which way taxes should go. These are not small policy disagreements. If they share my values, I've come to realize I have much more in common with them than someone who will fill out the survey the same way I will, right? Check all the same policy, be right there with me on the political compass, economic axis, and authority axis, and all of that sort of stuff, but not have those values-driven traits in common. And I don't know, to speak to Max's point, I don't know how effectively one can move people in that way, but as somebody who has personally felt moved in that way just by the climate that we're in and by some of the experiences that I've had politically over the last couple of years, I do feel that it's a beneficial change, and seeing the world from that values-driven, or as Max might say, a more character-driven framework instead of a policy-driven framework has felt to me a lot like seeing it with new eyes.
I can give you a great anecdote to that. They just had the hands-off marches recently. Hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people across the world got out and marched in those. We had over 20,000 in Atlanta. I was one of them. And I had some people going, dude, you're a libertarian. What are you doing marching with all these Democrats talking about, they want to stop Social Security from being taken away, which I have disagreements with how Social Security should be managed and eventually phased out, right? But ultimately, the main reason people were there is because they want to see more humanity. There's an empathy deficit in the White House right now in terms of giving people basic human rights, due process. When I hear people say that empathy is a bad thing when we're talking about due process for immigrants, I want to shout at them. 5 of the 10 parts of the Bill of Rights relate to the way the accused are treated in a court of law, right? There's a reason why those were put in place by the Founding Fathers, because any abuse of that is true tyranny. And so, I was out there marching with people who probably totally disagreed with me on the role of Social Security, who probably totally disagreed with me on how many government workers we need out there, right? And a lot of them are like, save my government job. I'm like, only after we review to see if it's actually relevant to what we need to be doing constitutionally. But yeah, okay, right? Like, that's where I'm at in my mind. But in my mind, I'm like, no, I'm here to let it be known that we are not okay with people being snatched off the streets. That we're not okay with seeing a police state being instituted in this country, that we're not okay with seeing the erasure of the constitutional roles and responsibilities of the courts and of our legislature. We're not here to watch the White House push everyone over and say we're going to do it my way or the highway. I'm not going to sit by and watch as a billionaire advisor to the president wanders through sensitive data that belongs to millions of Americans and does God knows what with it without any oversight. That's not something I'm going to jive with. And so if that means I have to get into the streets with people I disagree with on some economic issues or the role of government, I'm absolutely going to do it. The same way I did in Atlanta to fight Cop City, the giant police training facility. You know, I'm a police accountability activist. Ironically, I ran with a police officer who also believed in police accountability in 2024. But before that, I was out there protesting the building of this facility with people who were avowed socialists. You know, we could probably argue for hours on economics and on the role of the government involved in our economy. But that's why we were there. We were there to organize against the city of Atlanta spending a bunch of money to build a tyranny police state training factory. And so for me, sometimes it is more important to rise above policy, to recognize that there are more important things than policy, and that we have to meet this moment when those moments come. And they do come. And then when and if you don't meet that moment, what are you going to tell your kids and grandkids about it one day? When they say, Dad or Grandpa, where were you when I'm reading the history books where they were throwing innocent people in jail in El Salvador? Where were you? Were you sitting on your ass at home, or were you fighting against it? I hope that everybody here who watches this is part of the group that's fighting against it. Because if you're not, you're going to be ashamed later on in your life. You're going to feel great shame as you see the abuses of these people. Think about Kilmer Garcia, this man who's in El Salvador, who was sent there on a clerical error. Is that something that you want to stand up for? No, and it's not something I think anybody should. And so when we talk about moral failings, these moral failings have real consequences for real people. And if you're a parent out there, or if you're a son or a daughter, just imagine your father or being taken off the streets, because that's what Kilmer Garcia's wife and kids have to deal with. And it's a nightmare. And so we should not sit by. It's a moral failing on our part if people don't get up and be active, even if they disagree on the economics of the whole thing. That's where I'm at. That's how angry I am. And I hope more people are. This is a time for righteous anger.
Yeah, it's a time for righteous anger and for action. I think the other really important virtue, going back to your point, Tyler, is that a person is not only willing to listen to criticism, but actively seeks criticism because they believe that there is a possibility that they might be wrong, either about the facts of the matter or about how they're taking those facts and coming up with certain conclusions. So, Chase, you and I we'll get into foreign policy in a second. I suspect we're going to have quite a few disagreements on there. But I would rather someone like you be in a position to be making decisions on foreign policy, because I suspect that you are the kind of person who would not surround yourself with sycophants and yes men, and instead would say, okay, here's what I'm thinking we're going to do. Here's the way I'm approaching this. Now I'm going to find the smartest people I can to try and see if they can convince me otherwise. Now, they ultimately can't. They can't. And you do, something that you feel a certain group of people couldn't convince you of. But you listened. You processed that information.
Yeah.
You took that into account. You considered it. And I think that one of the biggest problems we have is we have a person in power who clearly has no interest in doing that. He surrounds himself with people who will be loyal, who will tell him what he wants to hear, and who will, he says jump, they say how high, and that's about it. That is a very dangerous position. And to me, that is another exemplar that he is not... That is one of the most important central virtues, especially for anybody in a decision-making capacity, in a political capacity, in a capacity with so much power. I hope that is one of the things that people consider the next time they go to vote, the next time they go to endorse, the next time they consider what they can do to change the course of these things is, how can I put somebody in power who I might disagree with on a ton of things, but I believe that if I'm right, and they're wrong about whatever the policy matter is, they will ultimately get it right.
Yeah.
Or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong about the policies that I believe, but I'm putting somebody in power who is going to surround themselves with great information, great advisors, and if they end up going in a particular direction, it could have been that I was wrong, but at least I know that the process that they went through probably resulted in the right answer.
I think so.
Well, and we're also putting people in these positions of power who are going to have access to a lot more information than we do, right?
Yeah.
So to piggyback on your point, Max, and then I'll let Chase run with it. It's not even necessarily that it may be somebody who knows better than I do, or I may know better than them, but they will unambiguously know more because they'll be placed in a position to have more information, more access to a picture of what's going on in any given policy situation, foreign policy situation, anything like that. So when we look to somebody who's going to have access to all of this information, if you can't trust their judgment, right? Like the key thing should be putting somebody there whose judgment is going to reflect the values you care about, is going to reflect things that lead into good decision making, like you said, Max, with humility, openness to new perspectives, because you may be wrong, but at the very least, you're definitionally, as a voter, more in the dark than the person who's going to eventually be put in that chair.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can tell you just that's a good thing to have in business, to have an array of views, to not be siloed into your thinking. Open discourse is a good thing in business most of the time. I would wager it's the same in politics. It certainly worked well for me. You know, on my campaign team running for president, I had registered Democrats and Republicans, a couple of them on my campaign team as well. I had people who, you know, I'm an anti-war activist. I don't think my positions on war are unknown, but I also had people who were hardcore differencing. You had a hardcore difference of opinion with me in terms of foreign policy, in terms of both either the war in Gaza, or the war in Ukraine. I had people who disagreed with me on my positions who worked in my campaign team, and trust me, we argued those many times over many campaign meetings. But at the end of the day, they were like, it's your campaign, it's your name on the poster, so, we have to go with what you're doing. Even if I disagree with you, I agree with you on everything else. And so, and they were like you, they would say, and I trust when you get elected and you see what things are really like, Chase, you're going to change your mind. And if you don't, you don't. And I still had that respectful discourse. And so even somebody like me, who is like, I'm a hardcore anti-war activist. Like, I'm the closest. I'm damn close to a pacifist, other than the fact that I own a gun for self-defense, right? So I can't really say I'm a pacifist, because a pacifist would allow themselves to be beaten, right? They don't believe in any violence. But I'm darn close. And when it comes to war and peace, I am about the most skeptical ever of government going to war in any way. But it doesn't mean that I didn't have people who felt differently than me in my sphere, ready to talk to me about it and challenge me on those topics regularly, out of respect. And I think that's a good thing. So for me, I think that's a moral weakness of the president, that he surrounds himself with yes men, or people too weak to say no. Right? Like, you wouldn't think, as the way Marco Rubio was debating Trump in 2016, you wouldn't think he'd be a yes man today, but boy, is he little Marco these days, feeling awkward sitting on the couch while Trump blows up our foreign policy, right? And so there's a lot of areas where, he surrounds himself with sycophants and yes men. I certainly, if I were elected president, wouldn't have a Stephen Miller as my deputy chief of staff. Let's put it that way. I'd have someone with moral character who would challenge me.
I was going to say, hopefully for more reasons than one. This might be a good opportunity for us to dovetail into a bit of a foreign policy conversation, though. Chase, I know you've been off the trail for a little while now. We want you to feel at home here, so we figure a little rough and tumble is good for any conversation.
Absolutely.
But no, it's look, Project Liberal in organizationally, and I think Max and I both individually are very predisposed to view the situation in Ukraine with a strong degree of moral clarity, bordering on sort of Manichaean moral clarity. There seems to be an unambiguous aggressor. an unambiguous case that Ukraine is fighting a defensive war that they're well within their rights to fight. There are contractual relationships and guarantees going back into the 90s where we've committed that if you find yourself in this position, we are here to help you. Shouldn't America be doing everything we can, at the very least with material support, to ensure that Ukraine is able to vigorously defend 100% of its territory and reclaim those territories currently and temporarily occupied by Russia?
Well, I think, when we look at Ukraine, first, you're right. There's a definite aggressor in the war, and that is Russia. They invaded Ukraine's sovereign territory, and the idea of the excuse of NATO expansionism, well, as somebody who doesn't really support the international order and would like to see, eventually NATO breaking up, which is something I'm sure we disagree on, I still don't find the excuse of, well, NATO was on his doorstep, that's a reason why he had to invade. Because, first off, Ukraine is neither a member of NATO, also Finland is a member of NATO, now sits on Russia's doorstep, and they're not invading Finland. As well as, we have military bases around the world. We surround Iran, for instance, and if Iran were to suddenly attack the United States, claiming, hey, the United States is aggressing against us by having all these bases near us, they're encroaching on us, we would not accept that as an excuse to attack the mainland of the United States. And so I find that to be a false excuse to excuse Russia's actions. So you can't excuse what Putin's doing. And in fact, I even met two young men on the campaign trail who had escaped conscription into Putin's army because they had been brave enough to speak up against the war. The story that you hear is that their mother, as this was going on, one of their moms, these are teenagers, was like, oh my God, I'm really worried that my son's going to do something stupid. And then she turns on the television and sees her son in an anti-war demonstration and is like, oh crap, we have to get out of Russia right now. And that's what facilitated them escaping. And so, and I do believe that Ukraine has a right to defend itself. Where my difference is that the United States, I don't think needs to be the one taking the military lead there. I think the European Union needs to be doing that for several reasons. One of those being that we don't really have military goodwill around the world. We've been engaged in military adventurism for over 20 years. It has destabilized entire regions of the globe, and we need to take a step back with those actions. What I want to see for us to do for Ukraine, and it's what I advocated for as a candidate, is we should be facilitating the bringing of refugees from Ukraine who don't want to be in the middle of this fighting, who want to escape the war, to be able to come and settle in peace in the United States during the duration of the fighting, so they're outside of being bombed with missiles. And I think we could facilitate that very easily in the United States. And secondly, we should offer amnesty for any member of the Russian military who is being there under conscription. Offer them amnesty. Demoralize the Russian front line by saying anybody who's being forced to fight in this war for Putin doesn't have to fight in this war for Putin. They can come to the United States on an amnesty claim, because to me, conscription is slavery with a gun. And so that would have been my policy, is to try to demoralize the Russian front line by getting those conscriptees off of the front line if they want to, bring as much aid in terms of non-military aid and assistance to Ukraine, and be the leader of bringing refugees into the United States while letting Europe defend itself, because an encroaching Putin westward is more of a direct threat to the Europeans, and I find them to have a more moral position to be fighting in that war in that way.
Okay, so I want to push back on this, Chase. You said that often when we send troops or material or support, military support to countries around the world, or we engage in military adventurism of one kind or another, it makes the U.S. look bad. It reduces our credibility around the world because we frankly screw it up a lot of times, even when we're trying not to, and end up in some cases causing more harm than good. I would say in many cases more good than harm, but that's debatable, I guess, from your perspective. At any rate, I see a potential of us assisting Ukraine militarily as a way to redeem ourselves, if anything, here. It's a way to show the world, yeah, we're still the good guys. We're still the ones on the side of freedom and democracy and liberty and a stable, chaos-free global order where countries can't just walk across another border and say, these are all my people, and, at the barrel of a gun. So if we can stand up for that, to me, that's a very honorable thing to do. It's a very moral thing to do. And from a strategic perspective, it would certainly show the world that we're not going to stand by while dictatorial regimes decide to do this kind of thing. Certainly, whether it's Russia deciding it's going to do this to Ukraine and then potentially continue on down the road into other parts of Europe, or other countries watching what Russia's doing, especially if Russia manages to succeed ultimately in what they're doing, and taking that as liberty to do themselves what they would like to do. I mean, obviously, we're talking about a certain island off the coast of China in the Pacific, right? That's very vulnerable to such things. So don't we want to kind of put out the message, this is unacceptable. We as Americans see this as unacceptable, and we're going to help to prevent this kind of thing from getting out of hand.
Well, I understand where you're coming from. Like, I see, the logic in your argument and what you're saying. I just push back in saying that, for me, I don't see any time that we've been engaging since World War II, that what we've been really engaging in is like a moral. First off, it's not a congressionally declared war that we've ever fought. And as far as us pushing and continuing, we've already given a substantial amount of resources to Ukraine. We have to have some sort of exit strategy. There has to be some sort of, is this going to be leading to some sort of settled negotiation? We have to see some sort of path to the war ending. I just can't accept that we'll just keep funding a war as long as it's going on. Because I don't think that that's going to end the war. I think that's just going to continue the war, and ultimately it's going to be a battle of who runs out of resources first. And, sure, maybe we starve out Russia, and it kills another 100,000 people in the process. I don't know if that's the best process to take. And maybe my mind would be changed if I was the guy in the room and sitting in the Situation Room. We don't have access to all the data that the people go through. But what I also do see is that a lot of the lobby to really push for more and more military assistance to Ukraine is being pushed by the same national security lobby that lobbied for us to get into the war in Iraq, lobbied for us to stay in Afghanistan for 20 years. And they had a financial benefit for doing that. And so I'm a skeptic, and I will continue to be one. And I think that there's a path to supporting the people of Ukraine that doesn't necessarily involve us continuing to fund the military-industrial complex indefinitely through taxpayer funds with no clear end in sight. That's where there's a bit of a difference for me. And I don't say that with any lack of empathy for the Ukrainian people or the average Russian who's being forced into economic misery because of this war, or the young people who are being fought to be, cannon fodder or drone fodder no one's cannon fodder these days. You're drone fodder, right? I don't like seeing this conflict happening. I don't know if us putting the foot on the gas fixes it any quicker. And in fact, I think it further entrenches folks like Russia and China to flex. And I don't know. I think maybe we need to peel back. And that's where there's going to be a difference of opinion for sure.
So this is where I think there is a valid difference of opinion, because I would absolutely not characterize providing aid to those defending against an aggressive military invasion, defending against an invasion that has at times been, and I use this in the textbook terminology, explicitly genocidal. The removal of Ukrainian children, the filling of mass graves, the all of this sort of stuff. The idea that Ukraine does not have a valid right to exist is Russia's sort of baseline position, or is Putin's, I should say, baseline position in this conflict. I think providing support to those defending is far from putting a foot on the gas. It is putting a foot on the brake. It is slamming the brake as hard as we can slam the brake. It's saying this needs to stop. It needs to stop right here. We're going to give the material support necessary to help stop it. because the gas pedal is the gas pedal that I think accelerates to a lot of the places that Max described. If Ukraine if Russia is either allowed to completely overrun Ukraine, which I don't believe they have the ability to do anymore, by the way. I don't think Russia can win this war by the standard that Russia had at the start of the full-scale invasion. But even if they're allowed a settlement that rewards their aggression with new territory, that rewards their aggression by placing millions of Ukrainians at their mercy in these occupied lands, that gives them some sort of monetary reward or allows them to dodge monetary responsibility for what is now over $500 billion and counting of damage that has been done to Ukraine by the Russian assault. If Russia doesn't have to pay that bill, if the U.S. is expected or Europe is expected to ride in with some kind of new Marshall Plan at the end of this and rebuild on Russia's behalf, if any of those positive carrots are dangled in front of this, we're going to see a 21st century characterized by more aggressive invasions, by every autocratic regime looking around at its neighbors and doing a rough comparison of military equivalents and saying, am I strong enough to take something I want from somebody? And if we see the rules-based international order disappear and no longer serve as a check on that, and this to be a profitable venture to go and wage aggressive war, then I think I can't think of something I would characterize more as putting the foot on the gas pedal. So, how am I mixed up there? Is that just is that just the core of the difference of opinion? Is that I see giving aid as exactly applying that brake when you talk about applying the brake instead of the gas?
I think there are other levers you can use to apply a brake other than military aid, and I think ultimately Russia's going to find that
sanctions, because I like sanctions too.
I'm not a big fan. I think sanctions are less violent than sending arms. Honestly, I mean, obviously, they have an economic effect, but I think this is going to be what costs Russia, what shows Russia that this war is not profitable. As you said, I think they've exhausted themselves to the point of where, frankly, very easily, if China wanted to invade Russia, they could probably do it and pretty easily win if there weren't the threat of nuclear war, right? If there wasn't the nuclear button preventing that from happening. And I do see ultimately this not being a worthwhile venture for Russia, both through the military aid we've given, as well as the economic sanctions, as well as ultimately the costs and lives from this whole thing. So I'm hoping that it will cool the heads of some of the more autocratic people. I also hope that the people of Russia realize why they are suffering this misery, and that it's not just the fault of the United States, which many times, sanctions will get fully blamed on us. But I would like to see the people of Russia, if there's going to be a war in Russia, I would like to see the people of Russia removing Vladimir Putin. Like, ultimately. Let that be the lesson for autocrats. Remove the autocrats. Let that be the lesson, because that's the real lesson, that if Putin were removed from power by his own people, that would be the lesson to these regimes that this kind of war is not worthwhile. But we'll see. That happens. I think Putin drops dead before he gets thrown out of a window, let's put it that way. And so the old Russian sense of how they change government. And so for me, I don't know. I think that anytime we dip our toe into it, it is putting a foot on the gas. And maybe that's where we're just going to find that disagreement and not find the common ground there. And again, I'm always willing to have the discussion and certainly talk to people who can try to convince me, as long as those same people are willing to hear from folks who would like to try to convince them otherwise.
And I think that is the core of this, Jason. That is why I'm so happy to be able to have this conversation with someone like you, because I think even if we end up disagreeing at the end of the day, you are the kind of person who at least listens to arguments, is interested in the arguments, is interested in opposing views. And again, that's why I wish I wish you were in the Oval Office instead of the creature we have up there now. But nuclear weapons was an important thing to mention here. I think one of the other a world with more countries armed with nuclear weapons, in my opinion, in general, seems like a more dangerous world. And so I think that the idea that the US would be a check on this kind of aggression, especially from nuclear powers, would be a check on this kind of aggression, was a world where all these other countries would say, look, I don't have to pursue getting nuclear weapons, because at the end of the day, even if a nuclear power tries to invade me, well, the US will do something to prevent it, especially if the moral case, as we've been talking about, is clear and obvious to everybody who looks at this. And so, but if the U.S. wouldn't want to get involved, or if we do this kind of halfway involvement that unfortunately Biden was doing for a very long time, an important lesson to learn, especially if Ukraine doesn't survive this, is you better get nukes now. If you're a small player and you're next to any other country that you feel could ever imagine deciding to be aggressive. Because nukes are the only thing ultimately that's going to protect you. It's not going to be the US, it's not going to be some global order about liberty and prosperity. It's going to be your nuclear weapons and your button. And I don't like that kind of world. I mean, of course, Ukraine had nuclear weapons during, when it was part of the Soviet Union. It gave up those nuclear weapons, believing that doing so would help ensure it peace from its neighbors. Turned out to not be the case, right? So, I find such a world far more dangerous, and to me, that's another argument for using U.S. certainly supplies from a military perspective, if not boots on the ground, to prevent Russia from being able to do what it's doing. And I would actually, to your point, I don't know that kind of sitting on the fence is the right way to do it. I would provide them with so much support that their victory, the Ukrainian victory, is assured. Like, forget it. The Russians aren't going to be able to do anything. Just to put a stop to this immediately. Anyway, how do you respond to those points?
Well, I'm not a fan. I am no fan of nuclear proliferation. I'm actually very anti-nuclear. And as I'm a pro-Second Amendment guy. I'm a libertarian. No surprise there. And when people always come with the argument, well, do you believe that people should be able to have their own nuclear bombs? My answer is always no. But I also don't think government should have nuclear bombs either. I think that it's a weapon of mass destruction. It shouldn't be in the hands of any government. And so I'm a big non-proliferation guy. And this is where I also think the war in Ukraine is going to create a bit of a gray area, because if we're going to want to see a world with less nuclear proliferation, we're going to have to see a strategic reduction in the stockpile of nuclear arms that both the United States and Russia already have. And that is another lever of negotiation that's going to have to take place both during and post, hopefully, right, the Ukraine war. Once this is happening, this is going to have to be something that we diplomatically have to approach Russia, even if they're led by a terrible person like Vladimir Putin. We're still going to have to approach that body, that government, to work on non-proliferation. Same with China, and same with some of these other nations that have nuclear arms, both declared and undeclared, and work to actually reduce the stockpile. And so that's something that's not going to happen tomorrow. But that needs to be a goal of the United States foreign policy over the next 20, 30 years, is to see long-term reduction and strategic reduction in our nuclear arms. And we're going to have to also play a role in that, as we're either the largest or the second largest. I'm not sure how many missiles Russia still has rolling around. We're certainly the most advanced and capable nuclear armed nation in the world. And so we're going to have to do some leading by example. But much of that's going to have to happen after this war in Ukraine is settled in one way or the other. Because we're not able to do that right now. We're not able to negotiate with Russia on the basis of nuclear arms treaties because, well, there's a war going on, and Russia's not going to be very involved in wanting to talk to us about reducing our mutual stockpiles so long as it happens. And it's another reason why I do think we need to be not being seen, and if we are seen as pushing, again, foot on the gas might not be the term Tyler likes, but if we're applying military aid, that gives an excuse for Russia to take a step back on the important talk of nuclear non-proliferation, which is something that I think we need to focus on in the next 20 years. Or one day we're going to see a nuke going off in a conflict that will be bad. And I want to avoid that.
It strikes me that there's a balance between raw number of nukes, which seems to be what you're talking about, Chase, and number of nuclear powers, which is what Max is talking about. I think a world where the United States gets rid of half of its current nuclear arsenal and Russia gets rid of half of its current nuclear arsenal and everyone declares non-proliferation victory. but we have a nuclear-armed Poland, a nuclear-armed Lithuania, a nuclear-armed Finland, a nuclear-armed
South Korea,
Iran. Anybody with a big nuclear-armed neighbor at this point has reason to not want 500 nuclear weapons, but want a few, right? Want a few so that they can have that same deterrence threat. I think that is a scarier world. That's a scarier world where you have this proliferation of nuclear powers, even if you have a reduction of raw warhead count. Because candidly, with time, warhead count reduces itself, right? As we get further and further from the Cold War, Russia's not properly maintaining things, which is terrifying in its own way, but it also means an increasingly large percentage of their nuclear arsenal is retiring itself. And candidly, as the U.S. gets in more and more budget trouble and starts looking at ways to cut military spending, drawing down nuclear arsenal that's very expensive to maintain is a sensible thing to do. But if we've now doubled or tripled the number of countries,
Which is why it's not being done by the Trump White House.
well, right, because that would actually be a sensible way to cut instead of just murdering whole departments and cutting headcount. But yeah, so I mean, it's a stark contrast to hear the two of you speak about it. It reminds me almost of a sort of type of non-proliferation conversation that I think we all grew up with, maybe versus a scarier and more complex post-Ukraine world, where if Ukraine is able to be looked at by these medium-sized regional powers as a country that was foolish to have given up its nuclear weapons, that leads to some very scary conclusions and likely some over the next decade, some real proliferation of number of nuclear powers.
I'm hoping we're wrong there, Tyler. I'm hoping you're wrong, and that we can see, hopefully in the post-Ukraine world, which I don't think this conflict lasts much longer, one way or the other. I think Russia's going to exhaust itself, and by the midterms, I don't imagine we'll be seeing this being as much of an issue. I think by 2026 November, Ukraine will be less of an issue because there will be some sort of settlement one way or the other. But I do hope post that we can focus the kind of foreign policy, the international eye on free trade, free markets, tearing down these horrible Trump tariffs, right? As well as, maybe holding less missiles at each other's throats. That would be a better world, and it's certainly the one I'd want to work towards.
Let me ask you this, Chase, out of curiosity. If Ukraine tomorrow did a nuclear test somewhere uninhabited in Ukraine, and they said, "Yep, that was us. Turns out we do have nukes again. We managed to get them somehow. Someone gave it to us, or we managed to build them. Whatever. They're not gonna say." Do you think that would cause the end of the war?
No, I think that would actually cause Russia to use their nukes.
To one end, like to nuke Ukraine, or
Yep.
Because if they want to capture that territory, it doesn't make sense to capture territory that's irradiated. That's not going to help them.
At that point, in the mind of Putin, it's going to be irradiate or be irradiated, because they have declared war against each other. Like, I think I would be worried if that were to happen, because I also worry that the suspicion in that hypothetical, which I don't think is going to happen. Let's be very clear.
I don't think
in
it's
that
going to happen
hypothetical,
either.
I would think that Putin would very quickly believe that it was the United States that provided those things, and we might be in the end game kind of scenario there. That might be the Reagan Star Wars kind of thing going on. So that would be very worrisome. It would end the war. It would. I don't know if it would end the war in a way we would like.
I think it
might
certainly
start a whole
would be
bunch of other new war.
It might. I mean, it certainly would be a high-stakes gamble. I'll say that. But I say that one other possibility is that Putin would say, okay, I don't want to risk one of those, especially if it's something that can be stuck to a missile. I don't want to risk one of those ending up in Moscow and blowing Putin up, because I think Putin cares about Putin, not necessarily Russia. They couldn't kill him. And so he would realize, okay, in order to preserve myself, I am going to, I'm going to pull back, because at this point, I'm not going to accomplish anything by doing this and threatening Russia with actual nuclear retaliation.
I don't know.
I mean,
Who's
it
the
could go
type of
that way
guy I
in the
wouldn't
end.
want to be playing poker with? Let's just put it that way.
I mean, third perspective, I think, Max, it changes surprisingly little.
You think so?
I think in that scenario, it is the great question of the 20th century, and I think one of the reasons that it's so important to get Ukraine right and to make sure that the peace is one that discourages aggression, because I don't want it to be a question we answer in the 21st. But I do think that the threat of nuclear exchange between major powers is still enough of a deterrence where those major powers could even wage conventional warfare against each other without resorting to it. And so I do think that were Ukraine to develop a nuclear weapon, I think instantly the idea that like Russian flags fly over Kyiv leaves the calculation, even in the minds of Russians, right? You can't prosecute a total war. But the idea that Russia could continue to fight to try to get some positively negotiated peace settlement that allows it to retain some of the territory that it's stolen, or that allows it to defer some of the cost of the war, and that the idea that Ukraine might, even if it had such a thing, would be disinclined to deploy it to the shock and horror of the rest of the world, but would rather, like, it would just take the nuclear bargaining chip off the table, I think. But I don't think it would end the conventional war. I think you'd still have all of the same problems that have to be untangled. And that's why I think conventional support is so important. And I know, Chase, that's something you disagree with. I am glad to see Europe stepping up and doing it. It sounds like you're glad to see Europe stepping up and doing it. I'm sorry that we are not a more significant part of that ongoing effort right now.
I just think we need to remove our footprint from a lot of this, and I'm very consistent in this regard. And we haven't really talked about it at all, but I'm the same with regard to our military support for Israel. Speaking of populations who have been greatly affected, and the Palestinian population in Gaza has been completely decimated in terms of infrastructure, their way of life, and we're seeing we still see clinics being bombed and the loss of life of women and children. And then we also have to face the fact that our own United States policy, like look what we did with the Houthis, where we have a signal chat of our own leaders cheerleading, destroying an entire apartment building to kill one guy that killed dozens of innocent people. And even people who claim to have been anti-war at one point. I'm looking at you, Tulsi Gabbard. Thumbs up emoji, baby. This is a great thing. And to me, it speaks to the callousness that the people in power have gotten to about war. They literally see us as chess pieces on a board. They don't see life and death anymore. And that's where I think we need to gain more empathy with regards to our foreign policy, not just in any one conflict in particular, not just the United States. I think governments in power need to start remembering that there are people behind these conflicts and not just policy.
That's an excellent opportunity, Chase, for us to segue a bit out of this foreign policy discussion, though I found it fascinating, and I appreciate you being a model of exactly the sort of person we were talking about, who, when you have shared values, policy differences start to mean a whole lot less because you've got somebody coming at it from the same sort of positive place. But we are where we are. Like you said, we've got this administration that is not just in foreign policy, but in so many ways reckless and unprofessional. We've talked throughout this conversation about the various many ways that the admin is trampling due process rights, is cavalier about foreign policy and national security in a way that jeopardizes American lives, is striking so fundamentally at the core of things that are so important to many of us. Taking candidate Chase hat off for a minute, taking, and I know that's a hat you've been wearing for a while, just talking to activist Chase, grassroots organizer Chase, guy in the field. How do we change course? What do we, the people, do? What do we need to be doing out there to fight back against this administration and where we are now?
Well, the first thing we need to be is visible. You can't do this sitting at home. I mean, there's a certain amount of noise you can make on social media, but let's be real. Social media is programmed and it is curated. And so as much grassroots effort as you want to put on, say, X, for example, it's going to get curated and algorithmed the way its owner wants it to be. And so what you have to be is you have to be ready to be effective to be out in the streets. And I am about to be putting the activist hat on, which is a hat I haven't worn in a while. It's a hat I haven't had to wear for a while, frankly. The last time I was out, marching hard in the streets was in the summer of 2020 during the George Floyd and the lockdown protests, right? So it's been about 5 years. But I'm ready and willing to get back out in the streets and be loud and be proud. Organize with your friends. Again, this is not about policy differences. This is about a set of values and a set of shared values that we feel the United States needs to be putting forward. Empathy, respect for the rule of law, due process, constitutional governance, the things we were founded upon. And so I encourage you to reach out to those friends of yours that might maybe vote differently than you do. Certainly, I've been organizing with friends of mine who, even if they're friends of mine, they probably, I haven't asked them if they voted for me or not, but I can be pretty certain that a few of them voted for Kamala Harris. And I'm not going to take it personally or anything. They know me and stuff, but whatever, I don't hold it personal. No, the truth is I'm going to have to be in a room with a lot of people who didn't vote for me. I'm going to be in a room with a lot of people who have no idea what libertarianism is, and they ain't got time to learn it right now because we're in a crisis situation. We're seeing people snatched off the streets. We're seeing due process completely ignored. We're seeing our own executive branch ignore directives from the SCOTUS, from the Supreme Court of the United States, which is creating its own constitutional crisis. Now is not the time to sit by the wayside. Get active, get organized. I recommend you use Signal or Telegram to organize because it's an encrypted end-to-end encryption, and start being active with your local activists. Don't be afraid to walk into a room with some people who you might disagree with economically if it means morally you're on the right side of history. And sometimes that's more important. I'll be real with you. I ran for John Lewis's seat in 2020. He ran for Congress. I'll give you a short anecdote about why it's important to organize with people who you don't agree with politically all the time. At that time, ICE was housing immigrant detainees in the Atlanta City jail, and we didn't like it. And so we organized to protest against it, and we marched from the jail to the federal courthouse there. And of course, we have speakers, and John Lewis walks up, and he's a legend in Atlanta. It's like the parting of the Red Sea. The crowd moves for him, and he gets up and he gives his usual speech about getting into that good trouble, the necessary trouble. You have to throw yourselves into the gears of the machinery sometimes to make it stop. But what he really said is I want you to think about where you're at right now. We were in the middle of the street. And behind us was a federal building named after a segregationist. He said, behind you is a building named after a person who believed that you could only go so far as the pigment of your skin. And that building is named after him. And he said, behind me is the Martin Luther King Jr. federal courthouse. That's a federal building that's named after a champion of justice who believed that it was the content of your character that determined how far you went in life. When you think about these issues, the treatment of immigrants, the due process, the respect for due process and constitutional governance, my question to everybody who's hearing this right now is what side of the street are you going to stand on? Because that's the question today. There is no other question. We must stand against tyranny. There will be elections. There will be candidates and campaigns, and you may vote for different people. You may vote for a libertarian or a Democrat or a Green or anybody that's not a MAGA Republican, right? But that's not what we're doing today. We are organizing to say that what is going on is wrong, morally. It is wrong. It's a stain on this country's history. The same as the Trail of Tears, the imprisoning of Japanese Americans in World War II, the bombing of Cambodia and Laos during the Vietnam War, the death and misery that we've exported around the world with violence, the robbery that people have had through eminent domain or any of it. All of it is a moral stain, and this is a new stain that we have to see being put on our country. And it's time that we organized to wash that stain out. And so I hope people can feel inspired. You may feel burned out. You may feel tired right now because of how stressful these elections are and how divided our country is. But remember, the arc of the universe bends towards justice. And we need to be on the right side of that. And it's not about left versus right. It's about right versus wrong. And so what do we need to do? We need to put our differences aside. We need to unite as one united voice and say no more to this. Frankly, any other president in my lifetime, if they had tried to do this shit, would have been impeached by now. And so the fact that we have not run this guy out in a rail, tells me we're not doing our job well enough. God willing, in the midterms, some sort of constraints get put on his power. And until then, it's up to us to do it. People power. Because he's a narcissist. And the thing he likes the least is people hating him. He wants to be loved. He is a deeply flawed individual. And part of that is a deficit of empathy that he has on his part. And deep down, he wants to be loved. And the more we can be loud about how wrong he's being, the more we can shame the people who are enabling him, the more we can put the brakes on this. And that's what I hope to do. And so, hey, I don't care if we don't agree on economics. Let's march.
Yeah, but okay. When you say being loud, and you say march, okay, so you mean march? You mean like go out into the streets, pick up a sign, let your voice be heard that way. What about other things? What about, like, do you think trying to write to Congress people and like get them to care more about this? Do you think that could make a difference? Do you think financially supporting, I mean, obviously Project Liberal should be the first place that anybody sends their check. After Project Liberal, do you think financially supporting certain organizations, certain individuals who are trying to fight against this stuff is also valuable? Like, where should people be putting their efforts to fixing things?
Absolutely. If you have money to spare, find organizations that are fighting on the ground level. Particularly right now, I think you gave your own free plug here. I'll obviously give a plug to the Libertarian Party, but I also want to say there are other organizations, particularly immigrant rights organizations, that really need your help right now because they need the funding right now to fund these lawsuits, to stop these deportations, to stop these actions. And so find organizations like that. Find organizations that fight for free speech like FIRE, who are fighting against people who are being deported just for speaking out against the war in Gaza. We've seen this right now with students losing their student visas. Support these kinds of organizations on the ground. And as far as writing members of Congress, you should absolutely, I don't care what political party you vote for, you should not vote for anyone in a primary or a general election in the midterms who are not saying, the number one role of Congress is to limit the power of the President of the United States. That should be that should be the single issue vote for the voters in this election. Is the candidate going to fight to limit the power of the President? And if they're not willing to do that, they don't deserve to be in Congress at that point. Democrat, Republican, or Independent. And so politically, in terms of organize yourself during the primaries to find the hardest fighter against presidents or overreach, and support that person in a primary or in a general election. When it comes to supporting organizations, absolutely take your money, put it where your mouth is. But also, don't just put your money where your mouth is. Get out in the streets and be visible. Because being a visible force for change in a peaceful, non-violent resistance way, that's what ended Jim Crow. That's what helped end the war in Vietnam. That's what helped bring about gay awareness for queer rights. Don't discount it. But also, you're right. There's a lot of other things you can do other than just marching. Put your money and your vote where your mouth is.
I'll say, too, anybody who's thinking, oh, that's great about reaching out and engaging with your congressman, but my congressman's awful, right? Like, there's a reason I shouldn't do that. My congressman doesn't agree with me. My congressman already agrees with me. My time would be wasted. Whatever excuse most people have for doing that. There's not a congressional office that you shouldn't be writing to as a constituent. If it's a Democrat and they're already opposing the White House and that they'd be willing to fight for separation of powers and that they'd be willing to support these things you agree with, hearing that from their constituents is going to put some steel in their spine, is going to put some pep in their step, is going to convince them to get out there and fight harder. If it's a Republican who you think, just because they're a Republican, might be hostile to bucking the administration, there are Republican congressmen right now that in ways and on issues are starting to break with the administration, whether it's on trade or whether it's on Ukraine or whether it's on any of these other topics. There's daylight now opening up between some congressmen in the White House. And sure, they might not have the courage to go full Justin Amash and leave the party and break on everything and speak against the president's character. They've got to do what they've got to do. But there are going to be times where they're starting to create space. And maybe you're in a real hardcore MAGA district and feel like this is somebody who's never going to oppose any piece of the MAGA agenda. They're hardcore in it. They have staff in that office that do not share their perspectives, who will be receiving your correspondence, who maybe will take a meeting with you. If you arrange a meeting, you're likely to meet with a legislative assistant on a topic you care about. And not only are those staffers going to have incremental ways to impact what comes out of that office, but they will work in other offices as congressional staff. They will go on to have careers. They have a network of other staffers. They will meet for drinks at the end of the day. As a constituent, you should engage with the legislative branch. As a delegate, you should engage with your representative and your representative's office and your representative's staff, no matter who they are, no matter who you are. It's always going to have some marginal impact. And if a lot of people start doing it, those marginal impacts add up.
Yeah, my local state senator's office knows me. I call enough to complain. So, yeah, don't ever let it be a deterrent. You're either going to support them and give them the extra oomph that they need, or you're going to maybe shame them a little bit and give them a little bit of demoralization to not maybe argue that bad point so much. And then lastly, the other benefit is if you're arguing against things that are being done that are really bad, that even maybe Democrats have been bad on in the past, like tariffs, maybe you do encourage a little bit more free market ideas coming out of them because they want to steal those libertarian-ish votes. So maybe give them, here's how you would actually win my vote. If you ever want to get it, you're going to fight for free markets, or you're going to fight for the rights of immigrants, or you're going to fight for this or that or the other. And so a great way to spread those liberal values is to not be so buttoned up about it. Don't be shut up about it. Be loud. Be proud. Trust me, that's how things change. I'm wearing a Stonewall shirt, right? Stonewall in 1969, started the gay rights movement. Do you think we'd have this all if everybody just shut up when Stonewall happened in June 1969? No, it required some people to get loud and get angry and to make their voices heard. And so if we're going to ever hope to rescue ourselves from the morass that we're in, just the terrible situation we see ourselves domestically, in particular when we see these kind of deportations and things, it's going to require us to be a little loud and be a little active and not shut up about it. So do that.
Chase, you're just about the most you're just about the most positive, good vibes kind of guy on this planet. Are you willing to very briefly entertain kind of a black pill?
Yeah, I will listen to it, though I'm a glass half full guy most of the time, yes.
Here's my question for you, and I know it might be a little bit grim, but let's assume that liberals get out and do this stuff, and I use liberal broadly, those who care about liberal values. Get out and they get in the streets and they march and they talk to their congressmen, they talk to their senators, and they go out and they vote. And it's just not enough. That nationalism is too strong, populism is too strong, and we find this country continuing to follow this trajectory of democratic backsliding. What do liberals do to survive in a more illiberal country than I think any of us in our lifetimes are used to having to deal with? Do we keep our heads down? Do you make noise in exile somewhere? Do you... what is the role of liberals become if we lose?
Or maybe put this way, how do we prevent ourselves from ending up on a plane to El Salvador or something else equally grim while we're the ones sticking our necks out, whether it's in a protest or donating to an organization that might end up on a list somewhere and then our name ends up on a list, or even being on this on here, what we're doing today, right? We've seen things get pretty grim in a lot of countries that have gone down a road like this in the past. My own family comes from Cuba, and things. It's pretty when the vans show up to cart people away. We here might be some of the first ones to get carted away. How do people like us, and like Tyler says, how do people who broadly want to do something, how do we protect our downside and the risk that we're taking so that we can be courageous in the ways we need to be?
Well, I think that answer is going to be very different for different people because for some people, they're going to need to keep their head down. They have young families, kids. For a whole different group of people, particularly people who were recently kids, they're going to be out and they're going to be active, and there's a certain segment of the American population that I think, if this nationalism really comes to like full-on fascist 1930s Germany-style tyranny, there will be a certain segment of Americans who would rather die on their feet than live on their knees. And like I said at the beginning of this, I'm not married. I don't have kids, so I don't have the obligations that a lot of people do. So I'm probably more into that latter camp. If the van comes for me one day, it's going to come for me. I'm not going to stop. That might not be the calculation everybody gets to make, right? Just based on their life experience. But what I do know is that even post the fascist state that Germany became, there were Germans, and they rebuilt, and they created a society, and they're a pretty peaceful country these days, And in fact, the shame of that fascism really created the tinder that created the anti-fascist movement that still exists in Germany today. That even if there is a far-right party that's kind of rising in Germany, I still think if you look at the acceptance of those kinds of ideas is still very taboo because people still feel the hurt generations later. And so even if we undergo that hurt, the black pill, it goes to shit, right? I'm still confident that there will be enough people to build something after. And I'm going to keep trying to inspire people, again, to be that generation that dies on their feet instead of lives on their knees. Because I'll be honest with you, I'd rather be dead than be a subject of a fascist authoritarian regime that doesn't allow me to speak. And so I'm going to keep speaking, and I'm going to keep fighting in a peaceful, nonviolent, resistant kind of way. And if that ends me up in a gulag in El Salvador one day, I did the right thing, and that's all I can remember, and that's what I'll have to hold on to through the misery of it all. And, it's a bit of a downer, but the truth is that if we don't fight, we're going to definitely get to that place. So let's prevent it. Let's stop it from happening.
All right. Well, Chase, I know that you have a heart out, and I appreciate you spending so much time with us. I want to make sure you have a chance to close things out. What's Chase Oliver doing these days? Where can people who didn't get enough Chase Oliver during the campaign, where can they find you now? What are you up to? What do you want to plug? Where do you want people to go?
Yeah, well, I've been staying busy since the election. You can always find me on X and on Meta. At Chase for Liberty is the handle you want to search for. And find me there, follow me there. I'm also on TikTok. I'm starting to be more active again on TikTok after a brief hiatus. So you can find me there if you want to be bugged with me on social media. Things I want to promote. I want to promote, of course, I was the Libertarian Party's candidate. I would encourage people who are maybe politically curious to check us out, to give us a look at lp.org. Or my website at votechaseoliver.com. I also want to promote that, hey, Tyler, I don't know if it will be out by the time we do this, but we do a podcast together about Star Trek. So if you want to check that out, you can. That will also be all over my social media if it's fully released by the time this comes out. But if it isn't, it will be upcoming at some point. So
if not, a tantalizing sneak preview. If you liked Chase and I talking about this and you like Star Trek, you can listen to Chase and I talk about Star Trek.
Yeah, it's a little more. It's only black-pilled when we're talking about the Dominion War. Okay, and so that's where you can find me. And then, of course, I am continuing to be an activist. I'm a member of my state's executive committee of the Libertarian Party. And if you're in the activist scene, there's a good chance if there's a major march or demonstration in or around Atlanta, if I can make it to it, I'll be there. So definitely be visible. And if you see me being visible out there with the bullhorn in hand, don't be afraid to say hello and say that you saw me on the Project Liberal podcast.
Thank you, Chase. Thank you for coming on. Thank you, Tyler, and thank you, Chase, for your courage. I think that's something that we're all going to have to get inspiration from you in these times when things are more difficult than they were. Hopefully we get through this without ending up in a gulag in El Salvador, but. It's people who are willing to stand up and willing to say these things and willing to go out there and willing to put their dollars where their mouth is as well, who hopefully could steer us away from the brink.
Absolutely. Thank you guys for having me.
Yeah, thank you.